Y'all first heard about me in that Bill Feezzyy story? Well, I'm back, bitches. And if I catch y'all doing anything illegal, I'm telling on y'all.
There is a place in the state of Georgia where no criminal ever wants to go. That place is called Alto State Prison, formerly Lee Arrendale in Alto, Georgia. If you come here, you surely won't make it out.
Stay tuned for Tales from the Toe.
Bill Feezzy's guy, Deputy Warden Galont, gets carved with a candy bar. Chapter 1. The Warden's Favorite. Valdosta State Prison had seen all sorts of inmates over the years, but none had gained the kind of infamy that Walter, Deputy Warden Galont, had. Galont was a relic of the prison system, a man who had spent decades behind bars yet had managed to hold power in ways most prisoners could never dream of. He had been locked up for so long that the walls of VSP felt more like home than the streets he left behind. To many inmates, Galont's nickname, Deputy Warden, was a bitter joke. He wasn't actually a part of the prison staff, though you'd never know it from the way he carried himself. The 5'10" stocky-framed snitch to walk the yard like he owned it, shoulders squared, chin high, eyes scanning for any slip-ups he could report. The guards often treated him like one of their own, partly because he had been their best informant for years. Galont was a snitch, and a good one at that. The CERT team loved him. Whenever a new hustle was brewing, whether it be contraband cream or phone smuggling or a fight brewing between rival gangs, Galont was the first to hear about it and the first to run to the warden. He'd been given special privileges in return: extra food, access to small contraband items, and protection from the guards. His arrogance was well-earned. Galont had built a network inside VSP that kept him untouchable. But his age was catching up to him. He was in his 29th year of imprisonment, and it was showing. His thinning gray hair, weathered face, and slow gait made it clear that his reign in Valdosta State Prison wasn't going to last forever. Despite this, Galont believed he could keep going as long as he kept feeding information to the warden, believing that as long as he held on to his role as the prison's most notorious snitch, no one could touch him. The younger inmates had no love for him, but Galont had mastered the art of intimidation. If they so much as crossed him, they'd be in the hole, which was solitary confinement before they even knew what hit their asses. He took pride in it, even taunting them sometimes. It was a routine that had served him well for years, but things were about to change in ways he could never have anticipated. Chapter 2. Bill Feezzyy. In Galont's dorm was a future well-known inmate, Bill Feezzyy. Feezzyy wasn't a snitch like Galont, but he had gained his own reputation. Then gangster disciple, now turned YouTuber, Feezzyy had been locked up for a long stretch and spent most of his time in prison learning how he would launch a YouTube channel when he got out. His YouTube channel would focus on disenfranchised youth thinking about joining a gang. Feezzyy was planning to make a name for himself by recounting his prison experiences once he got out. Feezzyy despised Galont. He saw right through the older man's veneer of authority, knowing it was built on manipulation and lies, but Feezzyy was smart, and he knew better than to directly challenge Galont. Crossing him would only lead to trouble. Feezzyy had seen it before. Guys would step out of line, and before they knew it, Galont would report them for something small, something insignificant, and they'd find themselves locked in solitary or getting a beating from the guards. Feezzyy had watched for months as Galont worked his system. The older man didn't need to fight or physically defend himself. His snitching was his weapon. In a world where strength and violence usually determined power, Galont had found another way to survive, one that didn't involve bruised knuckles or broken bones. Despite his disdain for Galont, Feezzyy had to respect the fact that the man had managed to survive as long as he had. 3 decades is decades. Prison was unforgiving, especially for someone with Galont's reputation, but he'd played the game well. He was Valdosta's king of the rats, and he used his position to keep himself safe, no matter how many enemies he made. But Feezzyy knew better than anyone that things in prison didn't stay the same forever. Chapter 3. The Unexpected Transfer to Hell. The moment Galont's world came crashing down began with an announcement over the loudspeaker. "Galont, pack your things. You're being transferred." Gallant felt a cold wave wash over him. He hadn't expected this. After years of feeling safe and untouchable in Valdosta State Prison, the news hit him like a freight train. He tried to speak with the warden to understand why this was happening, but the warden didn't give him any answers. There had been changes in the system, new priorities, and the new administration in Atlanta decided to move inmates around at their discretion. His transfer wasn't to just any facility either. It was to Alto State Prison, one of the most notorious and violent prisons in Georgia. Alto was known for housing a younger, rougher crowd, and Gallant's cozy arrangement with Valdosta's staff meant nothing there. For the first time in 20-something years, Gallant felt fear creeping in. He was no longer the untouchable deputy warden. Alto was a different animal entirely, and he knew he'd be stepping into a balls-jingling jungle where his past reputation wouldn't protect him. Still, Gallant was nothing if not confident. He'd made it work in Valdosta, and he convinced himself that he could do the same in the toe. He just needed time to find his way in, to get to know the guards and the players, and then he'd be back on top. But Alto had no intention of playing by the same rules. Chapter 4. The Deputy Warden's Arrival. When Gallant arrived at Alto State Prison, the stark difference between the two facilities was immediately apparent. VSP had its share of rough inmates, but Alto felt like a war zone. As he walked through the yard, the younger inmates eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and malice, some even throwing up gang signs and cursing at the 65-year-old. He could tell right away that these men didn't know who he was, and they didn't give a fuck. They weren't interested in playing the games he was used to. Here, brute strength and gang loyalty determined who held power, and Gallant didn't fit into either category. Despite this, Gallant entered Alto with the same arrogance that had served him well in Valdosta. He quickly tried to re-establish himself as the informant-in-chief, testing the waters by reporting a few minor infractions he saw happening in his new dorm. The guards didn't respond as quickly as they had in Valdosta, and the inmates didn't seem to be intimidated by his tattling. But Gallant wasn't one to give up easily. He figured it was only a matter of time before he'd have the guards in his pocket and the inmates fearing him the same way they had at Valdosta. What he didn't realize was that Alto had its own way of handling snitches. Chapter 5. The Snitching Incident. Gallant's first real attempt at asserting his influence in the toe came a week after his arrival. He spotted a small group of inmates from the gang called the Crips, running a narcotics smuggling operation out of the dorm, selling drugs called strips and cream, as well as cell phones and other contraband through an elaborate network that involved both inmates and corrupt guards. Without hesitation, Gallant reported the operation to the prison staff. Within hours, the SART team raided the dorm, discovering a stash of contraband that included everything from drugs, phones, to sharp-ass candy bar weapons. Several inmates were punished, including a few influential gang members. At first, Gallant felt a familiar sense of triumph. This was how he'd always operated, after all. But this time, things were different. Word quickly spread that Gallant was the one who had snitched, and the inmates didn't take kindly to it. Unlike Valdosta, where Gallant's influence had kept him safe, the gangs at Alto held the real power, and they weren't about to let a snitch run a motherfucking thing. Gallant started to notice a shift in the atmosphere around him. The younger inmates didn't seem to fear him, but they were watching him more closely, and the guards, who had once been his allies, seemed less inclined to go out of their way to protect him. Chapter 6. Threats Start to Roll. And it wasn't long before the threats started. At first, they were subtle whispered comments in the shower, a note slipped under his cell's door, a sidelong glance in the yard. But they were unmistakable. The gangs were biding their time, and Gallant could sense it. Still, he refused to believe that his old methods wouldn't work. He had relied on the guards for years, and in his mind, they were his safety net. As long as he kept feeding them information, he thought, they would protect him. But Alto wasn't Valdosta, and the gangs here weren't going to let a snitch rule the dorm. They began to talk amongst themselves, realizing they had a common enemy in Gallant. And in prison, when the gangs unite against someone, that person's days are numbered. Chapter 7. Gangsta Motion. In the shadows of Alto State Prison, the gangs moved openly. The Bloods, Crips, Gangster Disciples, and a few smaller groups usually spent their days at odds, but Galont had given them something to unite over. They all despised snitches, and Deputy Warden Galont was the worst kind. A senior Blood member known as OG Vice Grip took the lead. He was a seasoned veteran of the chain gang, and he knew how to orchestrate a takedown without getting his hands dirty. He'd been watching Galont closely since his arrival, noticing his habits, his reliance on the guards, his need for extra perks, his arrogance. OG Vice Grip had a plan, one that would take time but would be both devastating and untraceable. Instead of attacking Galont outright, as several of the younger gang members vehemently suggested, the gangs would set him up, turning his own snitching against him. They would make sure that when Galont finally fell, it would be his own doing. This was more fun than just rushing in his cell 20 deep and chopping him up with 40 candy bars. Prison was boring as fuck sometimes, therefore this whole plan became interesting. Chapter 8. Setting the Trap. The trap was set in motion slowly, with precision. The gangs began planting contraband in Galont's cell, a cell phone here, a small bag of drugs there, and finally a homemade shank. They did it over time, carefully slipping the items into his bunk and locker when he wasn't around, ensuring that he never noticed. At the same time, they fed Galont false information about a non-existent smuggling operation in another dorm. Galont, always eager to please the guards and maintain his status, ran straight to the prison staff with the tip, creating a diversion that allowed the gangs to finish planting more contraband undetected. Galont thought he was still in control, still pulling the strings, but the gangs were always one step ahead. Chapter 9. The Fall. The day of Galont's downfall began like any other. He went about his routine, feeling smug about the latest tip he'd given the guards, but that afternoon, everything changed. The CERT team invaded the dorm and raided his cell, this time acting on an anonymous tip. To Galont's shock and horror, they found the secretly planted contraband. The phone, the drugs, the weapons. It was all there, hidden in a cut-open part of his mattress. He protested and screamed that he'd been set up, but the CERT team wasn't interested in his excuses. His long history of snitching meant they took the discovery seriously. Galont was thrown into the hole, stripped of all his privileges. The guards no longer trusted him, and the gangs watched from the shadows, satisfied with how perfectly their plan had unfolded. Chapter 10. The End. Galont sat in solitary, broken and paranoid. He knew he'd been set up, but he had no one to turn to. The guards who had once protected him now saw him as just another inmate, and the gangs controlled everything on the inside. Without his status as the warden's favorite, he was nothing. For the first time in years, Galont truly felt vulnerable. His reputation from Valdosta meant nothing here. Alto had swallowed him whole, and he was powerless to stop it. Chapter 11. Final Blow. After weeks in solitary, Galont was released back into the general population, but everything had changed. The inmates openly mocked him, calling him Deputy Warden as a cruel joke. The guards didn't even acknowledge his existence. With no one left to protect him, Galont kept his head down, trying to avoid trouble. But the gangs weren't done with him. They made sure he never felt safe, constantly reminding him that he was at their mercy. Galont's life had become a living nightmare. Once he had been the king of VSP, the warden's trusted snitch. Now he was nothing more than a broken old man, trapped in a prison where his past sins had finally caught up with him. And in the end, Deputy Warden Galont met his ending at the hands of a 17-year-old Columbus, Georgia Crip named Lit World, who had just entered the prison system with 4 life sentences for the same number of bodies he had caught while unleashing a glizzy with a switch on it in a nightclub parking lot after some dude punched him in the face earlier that night for asking his girlfriend for her number. Deputy Warden Galont had gone to the dorm's microwave one night to heat up his shrimp-flavored ramen noodle soup and noticed that someone's bowl of food was already in the device, so he removed the bowl and sat it on top of the microwave, which was a big no-no in prison. If you see someone's food in the dormitory microwave, you are to go get the owner, but never are you to touch their food. When Litworld, who was on the top range, saw the old snitch touching his bowl of food, he ran downstairs and violently shoved Galont, knocking him down to the ground. Galont became so enraged that he hawk spit into the bowl of noodles as the man kept screaming at him. This was all it took for Litworld to snap and get revenge. He pulled a fairly large candy bar out of his state-issued boxers and lunged at the old geezer, slicing off his left ear in the process. Galont met his ending when he tripped over the cord to a buffer machine that was left out in the middle of the floor, the young Crip gangster pouncing on him with the blicky, poking him all over his body and face until the waxed floor was slippery with fresh human blood. Litworld already had life in prison, so the only thing the prison administration could do to punish him was put him on the tier program for the next 10 years. Hopefully, this story is enough to convince someone that prison just isn't the place to be.